I read a lot of books, and if you want to remember what you read, then one of the best things that you can do is to take book notes. This is true for philosophy, but also any other kind of nonfiction and fiction as well. If you want to remember what you read, you need to take notes. I've tried a lot of different note-taking systems over the last 10 years or so, and what I found is that these practices are often too complicated, they're difficult to sustain, or they try to get me to think in a certain kind of way that I don't always find natural. But I think I found the best way to take notes, or at least the one that really works for me, and I want to share it with you. I'm going to tell you about some of the mistakes that I've made along the way on my note-taking journey, as well as the really simple method that I now use to take notes. I'm Jared Henderson. I'm a philosopher, and I also love to read books. And if you end up liking this video or you've liked some of my other videos, maybe try checking out my Substack. I write several times a week on there. Right now I'm doing a read-along of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And if you become a paying subscriber, you're helping me bring this content to YouTube and supporting me. On top of that, I think you'd enjoy what I write. Okay, so the very first step in this method is to read the book and annotate. There is no shortcut or hack here. You need to take your time. You need to read slowly. You need to really pay attention. If the point of note-taking is to really understand the book, then if you cut some corners here, you're basically undermining the entire process. While you're reading, you're going to want to make annotations. By annotating your book, you'll become an even more engaged reader. But also, these annotations are going to set you up for success later on. This is a place where I used to make a lot of mistakes. And there were really three big ones. So if you take a look at my old copy of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which I've read multiple times, I've had it for at least 10 years, you will find pages that are almost completely covered in annotations. Just take a look at this page. More than half of the lines are underlined. And I actually think that this form of annotating is completely useless. Annotations are indicators for your future self as you read. You are highlighting what you think is important so that you can go back and revisit it later. But if you're underlining half the words, or sometimes even every line on the page, then you haven't done any of that sort of curation for yourself. You've just said every line seems important, and that's equivalent to not underlining at all. You could just read the page again. So mistake one was making too many annotations. I think that annotations in general should be quite minimal. They should be really readable, and they should be focused on those crucial bits of information in the book. That's for nonfiction. Obviously for fiction, it's a little bit different because you're not just reading for information in the same way, but here you might want to annotate things about theme, for instance, and not every single line is going to be relevant to the theme of the book. By making minimal annotations, you're also giving yourself room for a reread. Good books are worth reading more than once, and you're going to have different thoughts as you read a book for a second or a third or a fourth time. I think I'm on like my sixth or seventh read of the Nicomachean Ethics at this point. But because of the way that I annotated this book my first time and maybe my second time, I've just given myself no room for future annotations. If I want to make annotations in my book, I would need to buy another copy. The second mistake I made was only underlining. So underlining basically just highlights text, but it doesn't tell you anything about why you're highlighting that text or why you think it's important. So if I look at one of those passages where I underlined everything, am I saying that it's important, confusing, maybe difficult to understand? Do I think it's a callback to an earlier part of the book? I haven't given myself any of that information. So instead, I think it's nice to come up with different ways to annotate your book. Now, if you're using a highlighter, which I don't love because I don't like the way it looks, you could just color code. So like blue could mean that something is important, and this pink could mean that something is difficult. And you would just kind of come up with a key for your different colors. Instead, I now annotate just using a pencil. I will sometimes underline passages that I think are important, but if I think it's a whole passage, I'll use a bracket because it's fewer lines and it just takes up less space. I will circle words that I think need to be defined or I think are maybe being used in a weird way. That way I can think about how the writer is using them. I'll put stars next to important passages or important lines as well. And I'll put question marks next to things that I don't understand or find confusing. You could come up with your own symbols. There's a lot of flexibility here. The point is just come up with those different symbols to give yourself more information later on. My third mistake was writing too much in the margins. Writing one or two words next to a passage is totally fine, but I was writing entire sentences that were curving around the page in strange ways. And if you need to write something that complicated about the passage, I think the best thing you can do is find another place to write it. The next step for annotating is that I like to put these sticky tabs next to my annotation. Basically, I'm just flagging where the annotations are. This is optional. You can also use those metal book tabs if you'd like, but I think it's actually a very helpful step. Now, since we're talking about book notes, you might be wondering what you're supposed to do when you're out on the go. And I found one of the things I like to do is just talk out loud, especially if I'm like on a walk. It's a little bit inconvenient when you're out on a walk to just start writing. And that brings us to today's sponsor, Plod AI. Plod AI is a way for you to transcribe meetings or conversations or just thoughts you're having about whatever you're reading. They use GPT-4o in order to make the transcription a lot better, a little more accurate. I found, by the way, that this is a perennial problem. Accurate transcriptions in various apps have been really hard to come by. It also lets you record phone calls, but you have to flip a switch in order for it to be able to record any of your phone calls. That might seem a little inconvenient, but I actually think it's a nice feature. That way, you know that you're not like accidentally recording private phone calls. I've also been working on another project lately on a book, and I found that one of the things I need to do is just interview people to get their experiences or their expertise for the book project. And I can just record these phone calls and then transcribe it. And Plod can even add speaker labels to cleanly separate who was talking when. If you're interested in Plod, you can check out my link down below in the description. When we've gone through our book and we've annotated, we've tried to mark what we think the important parts of the book are, especially for whatever purposes, figuring out why we're reading the book. But now we need to go and do something with those annotations. Just annotating your book is not enough. They don't really count as notes yet. And I actually just think the act of annotating, if you're not going to do anything with it later, is also kind of useless. I just call this exporting. What I'm saying is we want to get those annotations out of that book into a format where you can review them more easily. And when I'm exporting, I like to use note cards. I use note cards because I like writing by hand. There are apps that you could use as well, like Obsidian. My only note about using apps, though, if that's how you want to do it, is to still manually write. This is especially helpful if you've been reading like on a Kindle or something where you can export your highlights and some of your thoughts. I would suggest manually copying those quotes into whatever app you're using. The reason I say that is because the act of manually copying, whether that's by hand or by typing, is actually going to help you retain the information and I think process it better. If you automate the process to make it nice and convenient, you're actually robbing yourself of an opportunity to review your notes and annotations and to start retaining the information that's in the book. Automation is basically the enemy of retaining information, but of also understanding complicated ideas. These books deserve your attention and you shouldn't bring too much automation into the process. So what I do is go through the book, and I'm using those sticky tabs to kind of indicate where my annotations are. And then I go through the book and I start writing down my thoughts. I will copy quotes that I think are important. It's another reason why the quote shouldn't be too long. Your hand's going to cramp eventually. I'll also add a couple of little thoughts about the quotes. I'll put a page number so it's easy for me to find. This is also a great place to write down sources that the author was citing that you might want to review. What goes on these note cards can really vary. Sometimes it's just copying something from a book. Sometimes it's adding your own analysis or thoughts. Be flexible, experiment, and figure out exactly what you need for whatever your goals are. This is also, by the way, a great time to write down vocabulary that you need to define. These can be historical references, bits of jargon, just words that you think the author is using in a strange way. Take the time now to define that vocabulary. My export phase is really similar actually to a system that's been used by Ryan Holiday and also Robert Greene, and I'm sure many others have used this system. I'm going to link down below to a couple of videos if you want a little bit more detail about how they do it. I think everyone does it subtly differently, and it's nice to look and see what the options are so you can figure out what's going to work best for you. So by exporting, you are methodically deciding what is important in the book. And that's why I say you shouldn't have any shortcuts. You should make the decision about what's actually going to go into your big stack of note cards. When you've gone through the book and you have your note cards, you're going to need to sort them. I mean, you could put them all in one big pile, but probably common themes have arisen, and you're going to want to try to manually sort those. Thinking through how these ideas can be grouped together is, again, going to help you understand the book even more. If you're doing a larger research project, so you're not just reading one book, you can start combining note cards from multiple different books because you're finding common ideas from different books that are all on some topic, and that's going to help you synthesize them in whatever your research project is. That's really useful for college students, but also for people who are trying to write a book. A major obstacle that you're going to have with note cards is figuring out exactly how to organize them. I think this is actually an advantage though, because thinking through how you're going to organize them is also thinking through how you're going to organize ideas. You're kind of doing that mental housekeeping that's going to let you remember and better understand what you're reading. And if you're worried about your note cards getting scattered all over your desk, I have some really good news for you. Some leading researchers have been investigating this very important issue for a very long time. And they realized that what was missing was like some kind of technology that would clip pieces of paper together. And they finally cracked the code, and they've named it the paperclip. And even better, the paperclip is very cheap. It's very accessible. You can buy it almost anywhere. So get some paper clips. That way you're going to be able to actually hold your note cards together. Now, aside from the actual reading of the book, this is probably the most tedious part of the process, but I also think that this tedium is part of what makes this an effective way to take notes. For a long time, I used to stop there. I even made a video about something like this system, almost 2 years ago, and I didn't really go any further than exporting and sorting note cards. But I think that I was missing a crucial third step that's really helpful for people. I call this active reflection. The point here is to actually take the information. So these are my note cards from about 2 chapters, and to actually do something with it. You don't want the information to just be static, the knowledge to just be sitting there. You actually want to take it and start using it, because that again is going to help you understand the ideas. Because once you start using that knowledge you've acquired, it's actually going to stick with you. This is the step that has the most flexibility. So one thing I like to do, but it's very tedious, is to write something like a lesson plan. So if I were going to teach, part of Aristotle, what would it look like if I were lecturing, say, undergrads? The point is to imagine that you're teaching it to people who are just a little bit below you in knowledge and ability. They're not dumb. They're not stupid. You don't need to talk down to them, but they know just a little bit less than you. You would need to introduce them to the subject matter. You would need to be able to clearly state the author's thesis or theses, if there's more than one. You would need to be able to define key terms, to explain arguments, and you would need to be able to consider complications and objections. Basically start asking, what are the sorts of questions that someone who knew a little bit less than you would have? I actually found this really useful lately. I mentioned that I've been reading Aristotle on my Substack. So every week, my Substack community has been reading, one of the books of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. There are 10 books in that work. And every week I've been writing about 1,000 to maybe 1,500 words, summarizing and lightly explaining the text. And I found that by actually trying to answer the questions that have been arising from readers who have maybe not read a lot of philosophy or read this for the first time, I've learned more about the text. They've actually been able to point out blind spots in my own understanding of Aristotle, despite the fact that I've read it many times. And so trying to explain it to people who know just a little bit less than you is just a really powerful tool. If that sounds tedious or a little bit boring, there are other options. I'll just talk about one more, but again, I would really encourage you to experiment here. In 1886, Andrew Lang wrote a book called Letters to Dead Authors. It's a weird book. I'm going to link it down below because you can read it for free. It's public domain, but I love this idea. Essentially, Lang just wrote letters to some of his favorite authors and thinkers. And while a lot of the book is just him praising, he's also raising criticisms and asking them questions. It's a really kind of intimate way to start engaging with the ideas in a book. So you could even try to write these letters to dead authors, and then you could eventually try to imagine what they would say back to you. How would they respond to the criticism that you're raising? Books are like this amazing technology that is able to get you into the mind of another person, but it's a one-way form of communication. By writing these letters, we get to kind of pretend like we're engaged in an extended conversation with some of the greatest thinkers from millennia past, centuries past, and from every corner of the globe. And you get to kind of imagine yourself as part of this grand conversation where you're talking about ideas. You could find other ways to actively reflect on the text. You could just write blog posts to try to summarize it. You could write mini essays. There's a video by another YouTuber that I'll link down below on that topic. The point is to just find some way to start using this knowledge that you've just acquired from this book, because once you start using it, that's how you really learn it. That's how you really retain it. You really remember it. And it's how you're able to eventually move on and start forming your own ideas. So you read these books closely, you annotate as you go, you export the information, and then you actively reflect on it. And that way you're actually able to incorporate that knowledge into your life and turn learning not into something that you did, but something that you keep on doing.